Aloha Cafe Radio.
So think about the last time you joined something, like a gym or maybe a frequent flyer program or some sort of professional networking group.
Right. Something with a sign-up sheet.
Exactly. Usually there's a very clear expectation of transaction there. You fill out an online form, you pay your dues, you get a digital barcode or a little plastic card, and boom, you belong. You're officially on the inside.
The very clean binary system.
Right.
I mean, you're either on the roster or you're not. And frankly, we kind of like it that way because it protects us. It defines exactly what is required of us, which is usually just our money, not our actual selves.
That is the perfect way to frame it. It's comforting because it's so measurable and low stakes. But then you step into the concept of true, deep community, specifically a spiritual community, and suddenly that transactional barcode feels completely inadequate.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, so we're looking at a landscape of belonging today that is vastly more demanding and honestly a lot more beautiful.
Because it requires completely abandoning that sterile contract
Right.
and moving towards something deeply organic.
Exactly. So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We know you're looking to cut through the noise and get straight to the heart of some complex ideas. Today, we're unpacking a sermon preached just yesterday, May 17th, 2026, by Pastor Yasushi Nemoto at Kahului Union Church over on the island of Maui.
Which is such a fascinating source to dig into.
It really is. The message is titled To Be Connected to the Body of Christ, and it's based on the biblical text of Romans 12, verses 1 through 13. And what's super interesting here is that even if you look at this from a purely secular sociological standpoint, regardless of your personal religious background, it completely dismantles how modern society normally thinks about building a community.
It really does. Because any group of humans has to eventually figure out how to define who is in and who is out. That's just group dynamics. And Pastor Nemoto tackles that tension right out of the gate by looking at the actual administrative structure of his own church.
Okay, let's unpack this. So he starts by outlining that Kahului Union Church has a very formal membership system. They have bylaws, there are specific qualifications, conditions, and responsibilities for members. For context, this is a very typical structure for churches in the Southern Baptist tradition.
Which means they operate quite independently.
Yeah, the congregation is highly autonomous and democratic. The members are the ones who vote on the budget, they vote on the leadership, they make the big decisions. So having a strictly defined list of who actually holds that voting power is practically essential for the organization to just, function.
But he immediately contrasts that rigid structure with other models, specifically mentioning a church called Hope Chapel. Now, Hope Chapel places a much heavier emphasis on a person's individual relationship with God rather than funneling people into a formal institutional membership roster. It feels much more fluid.
But the pastor makes a really nuanced point here about the illusion of the fluid organization. He points out that even in churches that seem completely informal, they still have bylaws.
Right, they have to.
Exactly. They still have governing rules that define administration, finances, legal responsibilities. The only difference is that they don't emphasize managing their people through a literal membership list.
And that brings us to the absolute core tension of this deep dive. Pastor Nemoto is standing in front of his congregation, acknowledging that they have this formal bylaw structure. But he's telling them that being a church member cannot just mean having your name on that administrative list. It has to be a covenant.
A covenant.
Yes. Contextually, a lot of people in this specific congregation had recently attended an English new member class via an interpreter, and the pastor is basically using this sermon to hit the pause button.
Yeah.
He's asking everyone to stop and reevaluate what they're actually committing to.
I want to zero in on that word covenant because it is doing so much heavy lifting in this text. Let's go back to that gym membership idea. I can pay my $40 a month. I can get my name on the roster. I can even buy the branded water bottle and wear the t-shirt, but...
You never actually have to go.
Right. I never actually have to show up to sweat. I don't have to talk to anyone. I definitely don't have to help the guy struggling on the bench press. The transaction is complete the moment my credit card clears.
Which is the exact passive attitude the concept of a covenant destroys. I mean, what's fascinating here is that a covenant isn't just an agreement to exist in the same building. It's a mutual active commitment between the believers and the church's leadership to walk together as a family.
Wow.
Yeah, it implies vulnerability. You can't just swipe your card and hide the back row.
Wait, okay, but if I'm signing a covenant instead of just joining a roster, isn't that just a scarier, more intense contract? Like, it sounds like I'm signing my life away.
Well, in a way you are, but the mechanism is entirely different. See, a contract protects your rights if the other party fails. A covenant is a pledge of mutual devotion even when things get messy. And that demands a fundamental shift in your internal values. You can't enter a covenant with a transactional mindset. You actually have to undergo an internal transformation to participate in it.
Which brings us to what I'd call the currency of transformation. The pastor dives into the first 2 verses of Romans 12, where the Apostle Paul urges the church to become living sacrifices. Now, for a modern listener, living sacrifice just sounds like, poetic religious language.
Right, it just sounds like a nice metaphor.
Exactly. But the pastor provides some intense historical contrast to show how radical this concept actually is.
Yeah, you have to picture the historical reality of ancient Israel here. Worship was fundamentally tied to the temple, and it involved literal dead animals. You brought an animal, its blood was shed, and it died as an offering. It was a very physical, visceral transaction to cover sin.
But the text pivots hard here. It explains that because salvation was ultimately accomplished through the cross of Jesus Christ, those literal physical animal sacrifices are totally obsolete.
Right, they aren't needed anymore.
Right. Believers receive life and the assurance of eternal hope through the resurrection. So, because of that monumental shift, Paul tells this new community that they are now supposed to offer themselves their actual waking, breathing lives as the holy offerings.
And think about the mechanics of that shift for a second. A dead animal is a one-time transaction. You make the sacrifice, it's over, you go home.
Right.
Being a living sacrifice means waking up every single morning and making a conscious choice to surrender your own agenda for the sake of the community and for God. It's continuous. True worship isn't just holding voting rights at a quarterly congregational meeting. It's the posture of your entire life.
I mean, that is exhausting just to think about.
Oh, absolutely.
If someone tells me my whole life has to be a living sacrifice, my immediate reaction is just like overwhelming anxiety. How do you even begin to do that without burning out in a week?
Well, the pastor completely anticipates that anxiety. He touches on a fascinating psychological truth about how humans attempt to change, pointing out 2 massive traps we fall into when faced with this kind of calling.
The passivity trap and the brute force trap.
Precisely. So the first extreme is waiting endlessly for God to just magically change your heart. You sit back passively, folding your arms, expecting a sudden mystical zap from the heavens that permanently fixes all your selfish flaws. You treat transformation like something that happens to you rather than something you participate in.
And when the magic zap doesn't happen, people swing wildly to the second extreme, exhausting themselves trying to reform their own hearts through sheer human effort. It's the white-knuckle approach to morality. You just try harder, you grit your teeth, you suppress your actual feelings, and eventually you crack.
Yeah, you just can't sustain it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Pastor Numoto uses this brilliant real-world analogy in the source material to explain what this internal shift is actually supposed to look like. He says that trying to join this community while remaining totally unchanged in your heart is like moving to America from Japan, but constantly worrying, can't I keep using Japanese yen?
It captures the psychological friction so perfectly. Think about moving to a new country. You can physically be standing in a grocery store in New York, surrounded by food. But if you adamantly refuse to let go of your yen, you're going to starve. The currency of your old life simply doesn't hold value in this new reality.
But hold on, let me stop you there, because if I have to totally adopt this new currency, doesn't that mean I'm basically useless to this community until I'm fully transformed?
How do you mean?
Like, if I walk through the doors and I realize my pockets are still full of yen, my old selfish habits, my old transactional mindset, am I just not allowed in the store? Do I have to wait outside until my exchange is complete?
Oh no, that's the beauty of how the text frames this. Transformation is a journey, not a toll booth. The pastor notes that when the place where you live changes, your values and lifestyle naturally change over time by virtue of simply living there. As people journey toward the kingdom of God, immersing themselves in this covenant community, the literal direction of their heart begins to shift. It's through that gradual day-by-day exposure that believers become able to discern what God's will actually is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be perfectly transformed to start. You just have to be willing to empty your pockets and learn the new exchange rate. It's a commitment to the process.
Exactly. You bring your yen to the community, and slowly, organically, you start trading it in.
Okay, so your internal currency is updating. The next logical question for you, the listener, would be, once I start figuring out how this new economy works, where do I actually fit into the larger group? If we're all undergoing this transformation, how do we organize ourselves without descending into some chaotic power struggle?
This is where the source material moves from the internal mindset to external placement, drawing on Romans 12, verses 3 through 5. And the foundation for finding your place is profound humility. The pastor points out that Paul, the guy writing this letter, had a very dark history.
Right, before he was the Apostle Paul, he was Saul, and he actively hunted and persecuted Christians. He literally stood by and watched the martyrdom of Stephen.
Yeah, he was essentially a religious terrorist. And because Paul carried the weight of that memory, he knew with absolute certainty that his leadership position wasn't based on his prestigious education or his flawless resume. It was based entirely on grace. He had no grounds to view himself as superior to anyone else in the community.
Which sets up Pastor Nemoto's warning to his own church leadership and congregation. He issues a very specific warning against organizational pride. He calls out the most toxic, dangerous phrase any established group can utter. This is how it used to be, or, well, the former pastor once said.
Oh, those are the famous last words of any dying organization.
Truly.
Whether it's a church, a tech startup, or a neighborhood association, the moment you prioritize past precedent over present growth, you're dead in the water.
Yeah, the text points out that these nostalgic phrases can gradually gain tremendous outsized influence in a church. People use the past as a weapon to protect their current status. But what truly matters is not tenure. It doesn't matter if you've been sitting in the same pew for 40 years or if you practically wrote the bylaws yourself. What matters is how continually you are allowing yourself to be transformed right now. The leaders explicitly desire to prayerfully interpret their own bylaws, not to fiercely protect a rigid institution, but to actually help the people in front of them grow.
And that requires a massive amount of self-awareness. You have to be willing to step back and say, maybe the way I've always done this isn't what the community needs today.
But the pastor also gives a highly specific warning on the flip side of that. He says we shouldn't force ourselves to suffer in a role we are completely unsuited for just because we were appointed to it or because there's an empty slot on a committee.
Right.
And I have to admit, that sounds a little counterintuitive. If the goal is to be a living sacrifice, shouldn't I just grit my teeth and serve wherever they tell me to serve? If I only do what I'm good at, isn't that just a recipe for only letting the most talented, charismatic people play? What if I'm not a great public speaker or an amazing musician? Am I just permanently benched?
It's a totally valid fear. But the pastor counters this using a surprisingly modern medical analogy to explain the concept of the body of Christ. He talks about the human appendix.
The appendix.
Yes. Think about the medical history of the appendix. For decades, doctors thought it was totally useless, a vestigial organ, an evolutionary leftover that did absolutely nothing but occasionally get inflamed, burst, and try to kill you.
Yeah, the standard practice was just to rip it out at the first sign of trouble.
Exactly. But the science on that has completely shifted. Modern medicine increasingly recognizes that the appendix actually serves a vital purpose. It acts as a safe house for beneficial gut flora, and it plays a critical role in the immune system, especially helping the body recover from illness. Now, doctors try to preserve it whenever possible.
That is so interesting, and Pastor Nemoto uses this biological shift to prove a theological point. God created absolutely no unnecessary parts. Even if you feel like the appendix of your community, maybe you feel completely overlooked, maybe you think your skills are invisible or unglamorous, you are actually an indispensable piece of the whole.
You might be the immune system of that community.
Right. You might be the quiet, safe house for the culture that keeps everyone else healthy. The text explicitly says that before God, there is a role that only you can fulfill, even if on the surface you appear similar to someone else. It completely dismantles the idea of being benched.
Every single person is required for the body to function properly. You just have to discover what you are actually wired to do and connect to the proper place, rather than burning out trying to be the lungs when you were beautifully designed to be the appendix.
Which brings us to the final major theme. If everyone is an indispensable body part, from the lungs to the vocal cords to the appendix, and they are all operating in the same room, Well, how does this not just turn into chaotic noise? What is the actual tangible output of this functioning body when it works together?
Right, what does it actually look like in practice?
Exactly. According to the text, the output isn't a highly efficient corporate machine. The output is radical love and hospitality.
Yeah, looking at Romans 12, verses 6 through 13, the pastor shifts from this high-level anatomical theory to a very tangible local reality on the island of Maui.
He shares how incredibly proud he is of their Japanese ministry. He says that visitors constantly remark, everyone here is so kind and hospitable, and he gives these really vibrant, specific examples from the source text of where this is happening. There's the weekly Tuesday Aloha Cafe.
Yeah.
There is the gospel choir. There is Dua Takase. All of these distinct ministries are actively welcoming people who arrive at the church with a mission purpose.
But think about the underlying mechanics here. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the pastor makes a vital clarification. He says some might look at all these new people coming in and cynically think, oh, the pastor just has a great Rolodex. He's just inviting people through his personal connections.
Right, like he's just an incredible networker driving foot traffic.
Exactly. But the reality is, even if the initial introduction came through the pastor, those visitors would never stay. They would never feel truly appreciated unless the congregation themselves sincerely welcomed them. A pastor can get someone in the door, but only the body can make them feel like they belong.
That's a great distinction. Furthermore, he points out that this hospitality is not done to receive human praise. And that is a huge, huge point. He says if they were doing all this welcoming and serving just to be recognized, just to get a pat on the back, they would quickly grow tired and discouraged whenever someone forgot to say thank you. They would burn out in months.
Because human praise is a terrible, volatile fuel source. It burns incredibly fast and leaves you empty. Instead, the text argues that this brotherly affection and hospitality are simply the natural attitudes and expressions of those who have been saved. It's the organic overflow of being joined into one body by grace. You aren't forcing yourself to be hospitable to earn points. You're being hospitable because your internal currency has changed. And it's just who you are now.
And I want to zero in on a very strong, definitive statement the pastor makes about what the church is not, because it stands in such stark contrast to how we operate in the world. He says the church is not just a place to gather with like-minded friends to do whatever you want. And it is certainly not a place for self-assertion, where the strong dominate and the weak are forced to silently submit. I mean, look at modern corporate culture, or even local politics. So much of our lives is built around self-assertion, dominating the room, proving your worth.
It is entirely countercultural. Think about a standard networking group. It is fundamentally transactional. You're there to leverage relationships for personal gain. You are looking around the room, assessing who can help you climb the ladder. The framework presented in this source material flips that entirely upside down. The community exists so that those saved by Christ can fulfill their unique roles, growing together in love, constantly asking, how can I serve the person next to me right now, instead of what can I extract from the person next to me?
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed from this deep theological framework of covenants and living sacrifices all the way down to the deeply practical reality of pouring coffee for a stranger at the Aloha Cafe. How does Pastor Nemoto land the plane for his congregation? What's the final ask?
He brings it all down to a deeply personal, dramatic call to action. He doesn't just let them walk out the door feeling warm and fuzzy.
No, he actually invites the congregation to physically sign the covenant that very day. But he adds a heavy condition. They should sign it with conviction only if their hearts are truly aligned with the direction the church is moving. He doesn't want anyone signing it just because of peer pressure or because it's what you're supposed to do.
And he leaves genuine space for those who aren't ready. He says if you feel unqualified or if you know you're still fiercely clinging to your old yen and aren't ready to let go, then listen carefully to what God might be speaking to your heart. Don't fake it.
But he immediately follows that grace with a very sobering reality check. He tells them, please do not delay your response, for none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. It is an urgent reminder that true belonging, true community, isn't something you can just indefinitely put off until you feel perfectly ready or perfectly successful. The time to engage the process is now.
Which really forces anyone listening to this deep dive right now to look at their own life.
Absolutely.
This raises an important question for you, the listener. Think about the communities you belong to right now. This could be at your workplace, in your neighborhood, in your friend group, or in your own spiritual life. Are you treating those communities like a sterile membership list? Are you just paying your dues, swiping your card, and stubbornly holding on to your old currency, wondering why you feel so profoundly lonely and disconnected? Or are you engaged in a living, breathing covenant? Do you recognize yourself, even if you feel as overlooked and unglamorous as the human appendix, as an indispensable active part of the body? Are you offering radical hospitality just as a natural overflow of who you are?
That is the real challenge, moving from the safety of the roster to the vulnerability of the body. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. We hope unpacking this framework gave you the exact insights you were looking for without the overwhelm. Keep asking those big questions. Keep looking for those aha moments. And remember, the next time you look at a membership card in your wallet, ask yourself if you're just on the list or if you are truly part of the lifeblood.
Fear is one of a kind of grow. People say, let's go grow. Hawaiian island vibe, gentle and soft with the sound. Aloha.